In 1991, a team of civilian divers made a discovery that should have been impossible. Deep off the coast of New Jersey, they found a submarine in a place no submarine in history had ever been reported. No markings, no records, no explanation.
And I checked some of my sources that I have here of known wrecks off the East Coast, and there was no known wreck at that exact position.
And when they finally forced their way inside, what they uncovered didn't just challenge history, it shattered it.
Whoa, wait a minute, right here.
What does it say?
U-869.
All right!
Because sealed within the wreck were clues that raised questions no Navy has ever answered, and secrets the ocean had guarded for nearly 50 years. The ghost submarine of the Atlantic. In the cold and treacherous waters of the Atlantic during the Second World War, the ocean became a battleground no less deadly than the skies or the cities above. Allied convoys crossed these waters with the constant knowledge that danger lurked beneath them, silent, patient, and deadly. German U-boats prowled the depths, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Their torpedoes shattered steel hulls, their stealth tactics sowed fear, and their missions were intended to strangle the flow of resources that kept the Allied war machine alive. Among the fleet of submarines Germany launched into this underwater war, a few returned in triumph. Many were destroyed in combat, and some simply disappeared without explanation. One of the most baffling of these was U-869, a long-range Type 9 C-40 submarine engineered for endurance. Nearly 250 feet long, it carried enough fuel and weaponry to cross entire oceans, while leaving almost no trace of its passage. Commanded by Captain Helmut Neuerberg, U-869 was preparing for its first war patrol in late 1944, a time when Germany's naval command structure was fracturing under relentless pressure. Communications were inconsistent, orders changed suddenly. Some were issued but never acknowledged, others were misinterpreted or lost entirely amid the chaos of a collapsing regime. According to the surviving paperwork, U-869 was originally assigned to operate near Gibraltar, a narrow choke point where Allied ships funneled into tight formations. It was one of the most dangerous hunting grounds of the war, but also one of the most valuable. A single well-placed attack there could cripple supply routes feeding the battlefields of North Africa and southern Europe. Then came the report that shaped the submarine's official fate for the next 4 decades. On the 11th of February, 1945, an American destroyer and a Coast Guard cutter engaged what they believed to be a German U-boat near Gibraltar. Depth charges were deployed, explosions rumbled beneath the surface, and oil rose to the water's edge. With nothing to contradict the claim, the military identified the destroyed submarine as U-869. The conclusion was logged, filed, and accepted as fact. The crew was declared dead. The story ended, or so it seemed. But history, like the sea, often hides what it cannot forget. As wartime archives were reviewed in the decades that followed, small inconsistencies began to surface. The precise location of the supposed wreck had never been verified. No photographs existed. No debris was recovered. The attack report contained estimates rather than confirmed identifications, a common issue in the fog of war, but one that left room for doubt. More troubling was the submarine's last authenticated transmission. It came from the North Atlantic, far from the waters near Gibraltar, where it was supposedly destroyed. After that message, U-869 disappeared from all communication channels. No distress call, no emergency broadcast, nothing. Historians began to reconsider the once certain narrative. Had the submarine been misidentified in the heat of battle? Has it been reassigned without proper documentation? Or had it encountered a fate no surviving record captured? While experts argued, the families of the 56 lost crewmen endured decades of uncertainty. There was no wreck to visit, no confirmed coordinates, no final chapter, only silence. The mystery might have remained buried forever if not for a discovery that took place in Jersey. The Jersey Enigma. In the summer of 1991, something surfaced from this underwater graveyard that no one expected and nothing in the historical record could explain. John Chatterton, Richie Kohler, and a small team of highly skilled Northeast divers had spent years investigating unidentified wrecks using side-scan sonar. The waters they worked in were unforgiving, marked by strong currents, low visibility, and bone-deep cold. Every descent was a technical operation requiring careful gas mixtures, precision timing, and a willingness to stand inches from danger. These were not recreational adventures. These were calculated risks carried out by divers who understood the ocean's hazards and accepted them willingly. Roughly 60 miles from Point Pleasant, New Jersey, at a depth of nearly 230 feet, their sonar revealed something unusual. A long, narrow shape appeared on the screen, unmistakably man-made and decidedly old. Curiosity quickly turned into determination. Whatever lay on the seafloor did not match any known wreck in the region. The divers prepared for a descent that would change everything. Their first dive offered little clarity. The visibility was only a few feet, the current pulled hard against them, and the temperature seeped relentlessly through their suits. When the wreck finally came into view, it appeared half buried in sand and wrapped in decades of fishing nets. Its form was unmistakable, a submarine, a large one, and it was not supposed to be there. There were no hull markings, no nameplates, no identification of any kind. The conning tower had partially collapsed, the outer hull was cracked and sagging, and rust had eaten away at nearly every surface. There were no flags, no symbols, no hint of nationality. The divers had found something that should not exist, a submarine lost where no submarine had ever been reported. They called it Yoo-Hoo. The more they explored, the stranger it seemed. No wartime documents recorded a German, American, or Soviet submarine in this area. And yet here it was, silent and untouched for nearly half a century. The team returned again and again, pushing deeper into the wreck with each dive. Every descent carried the risks of nitrogen narcosis, oxygen toxicity, and the bends, but each dive also uncovered new details. Inside, they found gauges labeled in German, equipment marked with metric units, and valves stamped with unmistakable naval manufacturing symbols. This was a German boat, but which one? Progress came from the smallest of clues. In the cramped remains of the crew spaces, the divers discovered a tarnished butter knife with a single name engraved upon it. Horenberg. Not a model number, not an equipment label, a man's name. That changed everything. Using naval archives and wartime crew lists, they traced the name to a real sailor, crewman Georg Horenberg, recorded as serving aboard U-869. With each new detail, the divers pieced together a truth the world had overlooked. Subsequent dives uncovered engine parts and valve manifolds still bearing their serial numbers. These were traced back to Deschimag AG Weser, the German shipyard that had built U-869. There could be no doubt. After 6 years of investigation, the United States Navy officially confirmed in 1997 that the wreck off the New Jersey coast was indeed U-869. The conclusion was staggering. The submarine had not been lost near Gibraltar as assumed since 1945. It had died on the wrong side of the Atlantic, thousands of miles from its supposed final location. Yet their discovery raised a deeper question, one no one could answer. How had U-869 ended up here? Its official mission placed it thousands of miles away. Its logs were incomplete. The German command structure during the final months of the war had been collapsing. Orders were sent, rescinded, and lost. Communication faltered, and every man aboard U-869 died with whatever explanation they carried. The wreck provided answers to some mysteries, but its location created a new one more troubling than all the rest. Something had brought this submarine to the American coast, but what? And as the divers prepared to push deeper into the wreck, they had no idea that the next section they opened would reveal something far more unsettling than the submarine's misplacement. The man who lived. The divers turned their search toward the families of the lost crew, hoping to connect faces and histories to the ghostly remains of the submarine. Their efforts eventually led them to a quiet village in Germany, where one name on the U-869 crew list carried an unexpected footnote: Herbert Guszewski. He had trained aboard U-869, slept in its narrow bunks, drilled beside the men who would one day sail into the Atlantic, and prepared for deployment as part of the submarine's final roster. But shortly before the boat departed, Herbert fell gravely ill. Another sailor was assigned in his place. The submarine left port without him. That single twist of fate saved his life. Decades later, Herbert lived far removed from the war. Like everyone else, he believed the official account that U-869 had been lost near Gibraltar. He had mourned his crewmates from afar, accepting that their fate was sealed somewhere in the Mediterranean. When the divers contacted him, they did not know if he was even alive. They had no idea how he would react. When Herbert learned that U-869 had been found off the coast of the United States instead of Europe, he was stunned. The divers laid out the items recovered from inside the wreck and showed him the water-stained documents they had saved from the ocean floor. Then they presented the knife. The moment he saw it, he recognized the owner. The name Horenberg hit him harder than anything else. Herbert remembered him immediately. They had trained together, eaten together, and pushed through the same drills for months. They were meant to sail on the same mission. Herbert had only stayed behind because illness kept him ashore. Until that day, he had always believed he would have stood beside Horenberg aboard U-869 during its first and final patrol. Herbert agreed to help the divers, not for attention, but to ensure the memory of those lost would not remain nameless. Through letters, phone calls, and long conversations, he began offering details no historian had ever recorded. He named the owner of a torn uniform sleeve found behind a bulkhead, recalling how its missing button had been the subject of teasing during drills. When shown a rusted harmonica found inside a collapsed locker, Herbert paused before naming the young sailor who played it each night to calm the crew. Piece by piece, he gave the dead their names back. Through him, the divers gained something no archive could offer, the human reality of the men who once lived inside the steel tomb they had discovered. Herbert passed away in 2005, never having seen the sealed compartments that lay deeper within the wreck. Whether he knew more than he shared or simply chose silence, no one will ever know. What is certain is that his survival gave the world a final witness to the men of U-869, and his insight helped close a chapter that had remained open for half a century. Yet the story was far from finished. The discovery of the butter knife had confirmed a life, but what waited behind a sealed door inside the wreck would reveal something far more unsettling about the submarine's final hours and the mission that may have brought it to the American coast. Because inside those sealed compartments of U-869 were secrets no one expected. Inside the ghost submarine. The first space John Chatterton, Richie Kohler, and their team entered was the crew quarters. Bunks were stacked tightly along the walls, barely large enough for a grown man to crawl into. Some still held remnants of bedrolls, their fabric warped and fragile. Nearby lay books swollen from decades underwater, their text blurred but faintly readable. These details transformed the wreck from a historical artifact into something painfully human. The mess area told a similar story. Plates rested where they had been left long ago. Utensils lay scattered across the steel floor. One preserved ration tin sat exactly where someone had placed it on what must have been the final day aboard. The divers described the atmosphere as heavy, as if the walls themselves carried the unspoken memories of the men who once gathered there. As they moved through the narrow corridors, the divers found small reminders of ordinary life. A locker door, forced open by pressure, had released its contents into the surrounding debris. A pair of leather gloves floated softly in the dim light. A rusted harmonica rested nearby, along with a deck of cards sealed in plastic. Someone had carried those items across the Atlantic, hoping for brief moments of comfort during long patrols beneath the waves. These discoveries struck the divers harder than any mechanical detail ever could. The men of U-869 were no longer distant figures from a history book. They were young sailors, some not yet 20 years old, who had laughed, argued, played cards, and tried to endure the monotony of wartime patrols. In the dim glow of dive lights, their lives felt close enough to touch. The control room revealed the violence of the submarine's final moments. Panels of shattered glass lined the walls. Levers and gauges were bent or broken, although some instruments still clung stubbornly to their mounts. German labels and metric measurements remained clear despite decades of corrosion. It was easy to imagine the crew standing at their stations, fingers moving across controls, unaware that their patrol would be their last. The most unsettling space was the forward torpedo room. Several torpedo tubes remained sealed, raising questions that had already troubled investigators. If the submarine had been attacked, why had the crew not fired? If an accident had occurred, why were the weapons untouched? These sealed tubes hinted at a catastrophe that unfolded too quickly for a response. Throughout the wreck, the divers found items that carried a haunting intimacy. Boots lined neatly against a bulkhead. Shaving kits stored with care. A cracked mirror that still reflected the beam of a diver's flashlight. One of the men aboard U-869 likely looked into that mirror on the morning the submarine sank. He may have adjusted his uniform, smoothed his hair, and thought of home, unaware that he would never return. What astonished the divers most was how much had survived. The cold water, low oxygen, and eternal darkness of the Atlantic had preserved the submarine like a time capsule. Paper documents remained readable in places. Clothing, including uniforms with insignias and name patches, retained their shape. Items that should have decayed long ago remained frozen in time, held in place by the sea that had claimed them. And yet, even with all the answers the interior provided, one question lingered among the divers. Something had gone terribly wrong aboard U-869. But what if the true danger had come from within the submarine itself? The theories of a silent death. When investigators finally confirmed that the wreck lying off the New Jersey coast was unquestionably the German submarine U-869, a new and darker mystery rose to the surface. Identifying the boat was only the beginning. The real question was why it had sunk. What had killed an entire crew without allowing a single distress call, a single attempt at escape, or even a trace of defensive action? The first theory suggested that U-869 had been destroyed by its own weapon. German torpedoes during the war were powerful, but their engineering was far from flawless. Among their most feared malfunctions was something every submarine captain dreaded: the circle runner. A torpedo that failed to travel straight could swing into a broad arc, loop back toward the vessel that launched it, and strike with devastating force. This was not speculation. Several submarines from both sides were confirmed victims of their own wayward torpedoes. Supporters of this theory argue that U-869 may have fired a weapon during training or in preparation for an attack. Before the crew could react, the torpedo curved back and detonated near the hull. The evidence inside the wreck seemed to support this. Several internal compartments showed signs of blast damage pushing inward rather than outward. There were no records of a successful attack, no survivor accounts of combat, and no indication that U-869 ever struck an enemy. Yet this explanation, while grimly plausible, was not without its complications. The second major theory pointed toward an encounter with American warships. According to United States Navy records, two vessels, the USS Howard D. Crowe and the USS Coiner, detected a submarine on the 11th of February 1945, somewhere near the American East Coast. Believing it to be a German boat, they launched a coordinated depth charge attack. After the war ended, the engagement was credited as the successful sinking of an unidentified submarine, later assumed to be U-869. On paper, it was a straightforward explanation, yet a closer look raised several troubling questions. U-869 had been believed to be near Gibraltar, not New Jersey. Why was it never connected to the attack at the time? More importantly, the coordinates recorded by Howard D. Crowe and the Coiner did not match the wreck's actual position. The locations were close, but not close enough to be conclusive. Divers exploring the wreck uncovered even more discrepancies. Several torpedo tubes were still sealed, suggesting that no weapons had been launched. If the submarine had been in a battle, why had it not fired? Why had the crew made no attempt to ascend, escape, or signal distress? The forward section of the submarine bore heavy internal damage, twisted inward in a way more consistent with an internal detonation than a depth charge strike from above. At the same time, faint exterior deformation hinted at the possibility of nearby explosive pressure waves, though not strong enough to confirm a direct hit. The condition of the interior told an even more tragic story. The positions of the skeletal remains suggested that whatever occurred happened with horrifying speed. No one reached the escape hatches. No one attempted any emergency procedure. There were no signs of panic, only abrupt stillness. Whatever destroyed U-869 struck so suddenly that the crew never had a chance. Complicating everything were the wartime records themselves. Many German logs from 1945 were lost or incomplete. The submarine that the American destroyers attacked was never definitively identified. It was entirely possible that the United States Navy sank a German submarine that day, just not this one. It was equally possible that U-869 had already been destroyed by a malfunctioning torpedo days earlier. Or perhaps there was another explanation altogether. Some researchers have proposed that U-869 may have been operating under classified orders, rerouted during the final chaos of the war, without proper documentation. Such a mission could account for its unexpected location, its silence, and the secrecy that surrounded discussions of the wreck long after its discovery. As evidence accumulated, certainty faded. Each theory answered one question while creating another. U-869 remained a cold case lying in plain sight, its final moments forever locked behind steel and silt. One detail haunted every diver who entered the wreck. The torpedo tubes were sealed. If the submarine had been attacked, why had nothing been fired? If a torpedo malfunctioned, why was there no record of launch? If the boat had been ambushed, how had the crew been caught so completely unprepared? The possibility that U-869 died without ever firing a single shot made its journey more tragic and far more mysterious. The submarine had crossed an ocean under stealth, only to perish without warning, without resistance, and without explanation. And then came the question that overshadowed every theory. What was U-869 doing off the United States coast at all? For decades, no one had an answer. But deep within the wreck lay a sealed chamber the divers had never accessed, a chamber that had remained untouched since 1945. When they finally forced it open, what they found changed everything: the hidden chambers. For decades, divers had pushed themselves to the limits inside the wreck of U-869. They battled cold currents, near zero visibility, and a depth that punished every mistake. Some areas of the submarine remained sealed by collapsed steel, unreachable even for the most skilled teams. Those sections were spoken of often but seen by no one. That changed in late 2024. Advances in equipment and precision mapping gave a new generation of divers what earlier explorers lacked. A narrow passage near the submarine's midsection, once blocked by twisted bulkheads, finally revealed a gap small enough to enter. Beyond it lay a compartment that had been closed to the world since 1945. Reaching it was slow, dangerous work. The door had buckled inward under pressure, its hinges fused by corrosion. For hours the team eased the structure open, careful not to trigger a collapse. When the barrier finally gave way, their lights fell into a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Inside was a preserved pocket of history. Personal lockers lined one bulkhead. Foot lockers sat stacked neatly beneath them, some still sealed because rubber gaskets had survived the cold and pressure. Ration tins lay untouched. Cloth fragments clung to shelves. Even the air trapped inside seemed older, heavier, as if time itself had settled into the compartment and refused to move. But deeper inside were objects that shifted the discovery from remarkable to unsettling. In a partially crushed crate, the divers recovered a pristine naval dress uniform, folded with ceremonial precision. Its insignia remained visible despite decades underwater. Nearby lay a ceremonial dagger belonging to a high-ranking naval officer. The blade, though dulled, still bore its etched motto. Then came the documents. Wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow resisted 8 decades of decay, the bundle contained fragments of naval instructions, lists with coded references, and English-language propaganda leaflets historically associated with psychological warfare campaigns. None of the items were definitive. None offered a clear mission. But together they suggested that U-869 may have been carrying more than standard equipment when it crossed the Atlantic. Every artifact was photographed, catalogued, and handled with quiet urgency. Some were sent directly to archives for verification. Little was made public. The implications were too broad, the evidence too fragile, and the questions far too sensitive. The discovery hinted at a possibility long dismissed. U-869 may have been operating under revised or covert orders that never survived the collapse of Germany's wartime command structure. Such a mission could explain its presence near the American coast, its silence, and the unusual route it appears to have taken across the Atlantic. It could even explain why portions of the wreck seemed frozen in a state of readiness rather than retreat or attack. The artifacts answered questions about the daily lives of the crew, but they opened a larger, more troubling mystery about the submarine's ultimate purpose. As the divers prepared to exit the compartment, one of them made a final observation that stayed with the team long after they returned to the surface. The chamber had not been disturbed by flooding or violence. It had been sealed deliberately, as if its contents were meant to be protected or concealed. It was this quiet detail, more than any dagger or document, that raised the most haunting possibility of all. U-869 may have carried secrets the ocean never intended to give up. And as the divers left the darkened compartment behind, they knew the submarine's story was no longer just about how it sank, but why it had come across the Atlantic at all, a question the ocean had guarded for nearly 80 years. Thank you for staying with us to the end. Kindly subscribe to the channel for more videos.